you put those men on my team, we're not going. No shouting, no argument, just a flat refusal. In the middle of a war, American soldiers were turning down other American soldiers, not because they weren't brave, but because bringing them along meant someone wouldn't come back. This is the story of the war where saying no was the only way to survive. The helicopter blades cut through humid air somewhere over the Laotian jungle. Inside, 6 men sat in silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. They had done this before, and they knew what waited below. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. 2 minutes. Staff Sergeant Mike Harkins tightened the strap on his rucksack and glanced at the Vietnamese soldiers sitting across from him. Indigenous personnel, montagnards. Men who knew this terrain better than any American ever would. Men who had as much to lose as anyone. The insertion point was a clearing barely large enough for the Huey to hover, 50 meters from a suspected North Vietnamese Army supply cache, 3 kilometers from the nearest known trail junction, deep in a country where American ground forces were never supposed to be. Harkins was the team leader. His job was simple in theory. Get in, observe enemy movement, call in airstrikes if necessary, and get out before the net closed. In practice, it meant operating with a team small enough to avoid detection, but capable enough to survive contact. Every man had been selected. Every man had trained for months. Every man understood that the mission's success depended on moving like ghosts. The Huey flared. Boots hit dirt. The team fanned out and melted into the tree line as the helicopter pulled away, leaving them in sudden, crushing silence. For the next 72 hours, they would be alone. No backup, no artillery support, no quick reaction force. Just 6 men, their radios, and the jungle. This was the kind of mission that couldn't be run with conventional troops, not because conventional soldiers weren't brave or capable, but because the mission itself wasn't designed for them. It required a different mindset, different training, and a different tolerance for isolation and risk. And when headquarters tried to add soldiers who hadn't been through the selection process, who didn't understand the culture of deniable operations, who brought conventional instincts into unconventional warfare, the men on the ground didn't just complain. They refused. The sentiment became brutally clear, whether spoken directly or demonstrated through operational pushback. Stop sending us these guys. They'll get us all killed. To understand why that attitude existed, you have to go back to how this war was really being fought. Vietnam wasn't just rice paddies and firebase assaults. It wasn't just Khe Sanh or the Ia Drang Valley. Those battles made the headlines, but the war's nervous system ran through countries most Americans couldn't find on a map. Laos, Cambodia, officially neutral, publicly off-limits to American ground forces. In reality, they were the logistics backbone of North Vietnam's war effort. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't a single road. It was a network of paths, rivers, and concealed routes threading through the Laotian Panhandle and eastern Cambodia. Supplies, reinforcements, and weapons flowed south along these routes, feeding the Viet Cong insurgency and North Vietnamese army units operating throughout South Vietnam. The United States knew this. North Vietnam knew the United States knew this. And yet, because of international agreements and diplomatic posturing, both sides pretended the trail didn't exist in countries that were supposedly not at war. This created a problem. You can't stop an enemy's supply line by pretending it isn't there. But you also can't run large-scale conventional operations in countries your government publicly denies having troops in. The solution was MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The name was deliberately bland. Studies and Observations. It sounded like a think tank, not a combat unit. That was the point. MACV-SOG was established in January 1964 under the authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to conduct covert and clandestine operations throughout Southeast Asia. Psychological operations, agent infiltration, maritime raids, and most critically, cross-border reconnaissance and direct action missions into Laos and Cambodia. These weren't the kinds of missions you could advertise. They required deniability. They required secrecy. And they required operators who understood that failure didn't just mean losing a firefight. It meant creating an international incident. The men selected for SOG came primarily from U.S. Army Special Forces, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and Air Force Special Operations. They weren't necessarily the best soldiers in the conventional sense. They were the best soldiers for this kind of war. Men who could operate independently, adapt to rapidly changing situations, work with foreign personnel, and make life or death decisions without waiting for higher approval. And critically, they understood the mission. They understood why they were there. They understood what the stakes were. If stories like this aren't taught in school, that's what this channel exists for. Subscribe to American Hidden Wars. Conventional forces by design operated differently. Large formations, clear command structures, established supply lines, defined front lines. These weren't weaknesses. They were the product of centuries of military doctrine refined for large-scale conflict. But in a war where success meant staying invisible, where detection could mean death, and where political constraints made every operation a calculated risk, conventional approaches became liabilities. This wasn't a judgment on the courage or competence of conventional soldiers. It was a recognition that the mission demanded something different. And when you started mixing soldiers who hadn't been selected for unconventional warfare into units designed for it, people died. The U.S. military has never been a monolithic organization. It's a collection of cultures, doctrines, and identities that sometimes align and sometimes clash. By 1965, the conventional forces in Vietnam were being structured around General William Westmoreland's attrition strategy. The goal was to inflict enough casualties on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army that Hanoi would be forced to negotiate. Large unit sweeps, search and destroy operations, fire-based construction, artillery support, air mobility. It was a numbers game. Body counts, kill ratios. The underlying assumption was that superior firepower and manpower would eventually break the enemy's will. Special forces, meanwhile, operated under a fundamentally different philosophy. They had been shaped by decades of irregular warfare doctrine, starting with the Office of Strategic Services in World War II and evolving through the conflicts in Korea, Laos, and early Vietnam. Their mission wasn't to control territory or rack up body counts. It was to work through indigenous forces, to gather intelligence, to disrupt enemy operations, and to create effects disproportionate to their small numbers. The early Special Forces mission in Vietnam reflected this. The Civilian Irregular Defense Group Program, or CIDG, was launched in the early 1960s to organize and train Montagnard tribesmen and other minority groups in Vietnam's Central Highlands. These weren't conventional soldiers. They were villagers, hunters, and farmers who knew the terrain intimately and had their own reasons for opposing Hanoi. Special Forces A-teams lived in remote camps with these irregular forces. They trained them, fought alongside them, and in many cases, earned their trust in ways that large conventional units never could. But as the war escalated and MACV-SOG was activated for cross-border operations, the cultural divide deepened. SOG operators began to see themselves as fundamentally separate from the broader military apparatus. They had different standards, different selection criteria, different expectations of autonomy, and they protected that separation fiercely. By late 1966, as SOG missions into Laos intensified, conventional commanders began proposing augmentation. More teams meant more intelligence, more strikes, more disruption of enemy logistics. The logic was straightforward. If cross-border recon worked, scale it up. But scaling required bodies, and there weren't enough fully vetted, trained SOG personnel to fill the demand. That's when the proposals came. Supplement recon teams with experienced infantrymen from conventional line units. Good soldiers. Combat veterans. Men who had proven themselves in firefights throughout South Vietnam. The SOG leadership response was immediate and unambiguous. Absolutely not. The friction surfaced during mission planning sessions at SOG's forward operating bases along the Laotian border. Command and Control North, operating out of Da Nang and later Phu Bai, was running an increasing number of cross-border missions under Operation Prairie Fire. The tempo was brutal. Teams were going in, staying out for days, and coming back if they came back, exhausted and shot up. Conventional liaison officers, assigned to coordinate between SOG and regular Army aviation and support units, saw the strain and suggested bringing in additional personnel from nearby infantry battalions to increase team sizes and provide backup. One SOG team leader, running missions out of the launch site at Khe San, made the unit's position clear during a briefing. The conversation, as reconstructed from later accounts, went something like this. You want to add how many? 4, maybe 6, infantry from the 26th Marines. Good men. Combat experienced. Have they been through selection? They don't need selection. They've been in country for 8 months. They know how to fight. This isn't fighting. This is not getting found. There's a difference, the officer pushed back. The numbers made sense on paper. Larger teams could carry more equipment, provide better security, and sustain contact longer if things went bad. The team leader's response cut through the logic. Larger teams make more noise. More noise gets you compromised. Compromised means dead. I'm not taking anyone who hasn't trained for this. The conversation didn't end there. It escalated up the chain. Conventional commanders saw it as Special Forces gatekeeping. SOG operators saw it as conventional leadership fundamentally misunderstanding the mission. But the critical point was made. The mission couldn't absorb untrained personnel, no matter how experienced they were in conventional operations. The proposal was shelved. For the moment. In March 1965, MACV-SOG received formal authorization to begin sustained cross-border reconnaissance operations into Laos. These missions, codenamed Operation Shining Brass, were tightly controlled. Each mission required approval from higher headquarters, and the operational area was limited to a narrow strip of Laotian territory adjacent to South Vietnam's border. The restrictions reflected political nervousness. Even though the operations were classified, there was always the risk of exposure. A team could be overrun. A helicopter could be shot down. A prisoner could be taken. And if any of that happened, the U.S.'s government wanted to be able to maintain deniability. The first missions were cautious. Small teams inserted near suspected trail segments. Their job was to observe, report, and avoid contact if possible. But avoidance wasn't always an option. Teams learned quickly what worked and what didn't. Speed mattered. Silence mattered. Trust between Americans and indigenous teammates mattered most of all. One early mission illustrated the stakes. A 6-man team, 2 Americans and 4 Montagnards, inserted into a valley northeast of the Chapone logistics hub in October 1965. The mission was pure reconnaissance. Locate a suspected storage area, confirm enemy activity, and call in coordinates for an airstrike. The insertion went clean. The team moved into position and observed NVA troops moving supplies at night. They reported. Air support was scheduled for the following evening, but during extraction, the helicopter took fire on approach. The pilot waved off. The team had to move to an alternate landing zone, 2 kilometers away, through terrain they hadn't scouted. During the movement, one of the Americans twisted his ankle badly on a concealed route. He could barely walk. The team slowed. They missed the window for the secondary extraction. and as darkness fell, they heard voices moving through the jungle around them. They went quiet, completely silent. For 6 hours, they lay in place as NVA patrols searched the area. No movement, no sound, controlled breathing. The Montagnards knew what to do. They had trained for this. They understood the rhythm of evasion. The Americans trusted them completely, and that trust was returned. At dawn, they moved again. Slowly, methodically. They reached a clearing, called for extraction, and got out. That mission worked because everyone on the team knew the rules. Silence, patience, trust. Now imagine the same mission with 2 additional personnel who hadn't trained for this, who didn't know the hand signals, who might cough or shift position at the wrong moment, or question a decision made by the indigenous teammates. The entire team would have been compromised. Moments like this decided who lived and who didn't. If you want more real war stories like this, like the video and stay with the channel. By 1967, SOG was running missions deeper into Laos and into Cambodia under Operation Daniel Boone. The operational tempo increased, the enemy adapted, and the pressure to expand SOG's footprint grew. The breaking point came in early 1968, in the chaotic months following the Tet Offensive. Conventional forces throughout Vietnam were stretched thin. SOG operations, meanwhile, were producing critical intelligence on enemy movements along the trail. Higher command wanted more missions, more teams, more coverage. A directive came down: augment existing SOG recon teams with personnel from conventional infantry units to increase operational capacity. The response from SOG's operational leadership wasn't just resistance. It was a line in the sand. At Command and Control Central, the forward operating base responsible for missions into Cambodia, a confrontation occurred during a coordination meeting. A conventional colonel, frustrated by what he saw as Special Forces intransigence, made his case directly. The reconstruction of what followed, drawn from post-war interviews with personnel present, reflects the intensity of the divide. The colonel argued that his infantrymen had proven themselves in combat. They were disciplined, they followed orders, they could handle the physical demands. A SOG captain, one of the more experienced cross-border operators, responded with barely controlled frustration. He explained, again, that the issue wasn't competence, it was preparation. His teams moved in total silence for days. They worked with Montagnards and Cambodian mercenaries who didn't speak English. They made split-second decisions about when to engage and when to evade, decisions that required understanding the specific mission parameters of deniable operations. The colonel pushed harder. Resources were being wasted, slots were going unfilled, men were available. The captain's response was blunt. "Your men will get my men killed. I'm not taking them." The meeting didn't resolve the issue. It simply clarified that SOG would not compromise on personnel standards, regardless of external pressure. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across SOG's area of operations, similar confrontations played out. Team leaders refused personnel, training officers rejected candidates, and in some cases, soldiers who had been assigned to SOG without going through proper selection were quietly sent back to their original units after arriving at forward operating bases. The phrase, "Stop sending us these guys," whether spoken in exactly those words or communicated through repeated operational refusals, became the unit's position. But the resistance wasn't just about protecting standards. It was grounded in specific, documented failures when the wrong personnel ended up on missions. In one case, a team augmented with a conventional radio operator for a mission into the A Shao Valley experienced a near-catastrophic compromise. During movement, the operator, unfamiliar with the hand signals used by the indigenous personnel, spoke aloud to ask for clarification. The sound carried. An NVA patrol investigating the area changed direction. The team had to break contact immediately and call for emergency extraction. They made it out, but the mission was aborted, and the intelligence target was lost. In another incident, a team operating near the tri-border area took on an experienced infantry sergeant to provide additional security. The sergeant, accustomed to conventional patrol tactics, repeatedly questioned the team leader's decisions about route selection and movement speed. The tension fractured the team's cohesion. The indigenous personnel, sensing the disunity, began deferring to the American sergeant rather than following the team leader's instructions. The mission didn't end in disaster, but it came close. And when the team returned, the sergeant was removed, and the team leader filed a report making clear that future augmentation would be rejected outright. These weren't failures of courage. They were failures of compatibility. The soldiers in question weren't bad troops. They were the wrong troops for this mission. SOG operators understood this with a clarity that came from watching what happened when the wrong variables entered the equation. Noise got you detected. Hesitation got you killed. Misunderstanding your teammates got everyone killed. And that's why the rejection was absolute. The war punished the unprepared ruthlessly, and SOG had no interest in being punished for someone else's lack of understanding. By the late 1960s, the war in Vietnam had become deeply unpopular in the United States. The Tet Offensive in 1968, despite being a tactical defeat for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, shattered public confidence in official claims that the war was being won. Protests intensified. Political pressure mounted. In 1969, President Richard Nixon announced a policy of Vietnamization, shifting combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. This wasn't just a tactical adjustment. It was a strategic reorientation driven by domestic politics. For MACV-SOG, Vietnamization had direct consequences. As the overall American presence in Southeast Asia decreased, the political sensitivity around cross-border operations increased. Every mission carried the risk of exposure, and exposure could undermine the broader withdrawal narrative. Congressional oversight tightened. By the early 1970s, legal restrictions prohibited American personnel from accompanying operations into Cambodia, and in some cases, Laos. This fundamentally changed how SOG missions were conducted. Teams that had been built around American leadership now had to rely on indigenous personnel to lead missions independently. Americans could plan, coordinate air support, and manage logistics, but they couldn't always be on the ground. This wasn't necessarily a failure. Many indigenous SOG personnel were highly skilled and had been operating in this environment for years, but it did represent a shift in how the missions were executed and what could realistically be achieved. The institutional pressure to expand SOG by adding conventional personnel faded, not because the arguments changed, but because the war itself was ending. The question of who should run cross-border missions became moot when there were fewer Americans available to run them at all. Operational tempo remained high through 1971, but the writing was on the wall. American combat forces were leaving Vietnam. The political will to sustain covert operations in neighboring countries was eroding. And the broader strategic question, whether the war could be won at all, was being answered in the negative. Most people never hear about this side of the war. If this is new to you, subscribing helps keep these stories alive. The missions continued because the enemy's logistics network continued. North Vietnamese forces kept using the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They kept infiltrating South Vietnam, and as long as they did, there was a military logic to disrupting those operations. But military logic doesn't always align with political reality. On April 30, 1972, MACV-SOG was officially deactivated. There was no ceremony, no parade, no public acknowledgement of what the unit had accomplished or what its personnel had endured. The war was winding down, at least for American ground forces, and SOG's mission no longer fit within the new strategic framework. The deactivation was administrative. Equipment was transferred. Personnel were reassigned. Records were classified, and the operations that had defined years of covert warfare simply ceased to exist in any official sense. For the men who had run those missions, who had inserted into Laos in the dead of night, who had called in airstrikes on enemy convoys, who had evaded capture by hours or minutes, who had lost teammates and indigenous partners, who had fought to protect the integrity of their units against institutional pressure to compromise standards, the ending was abrupt and unsatisfying. There was no resolution. The Ho Chi Minh Trail continued to function. North Vietnamese forces continued to operate, and 3 years later, in 1975, South Vietnam fell. The secret war in Laos and Cambodia hadn't stopped the larger war. It had complicated it, disrupted it, forced the enemy to divert resources and adapt tactics. But it hadn't changed the outcome. For decades, the full scope of MACV-SOG's operations remained classified. Veterans couldn't talk openly about their service. Families didn't know what their loved ones had actually done. And the broader public remained largely unaware that American forces had been fighting a sustained ground war in countries the U.S. government claimed to have no troops in. It wasn't until the late 1980s and 1990s, as documents were declassified and veterans began speaking publicly, that the story started to emerge. Books were written, interviews were conducted, and slowly, the hidden war became part of the historical record. But even now, most people don't know it happened. They know about Khe Sanh and the fall of Saigon. They've heard of Agent Orange and the My Lai massacre. But they don't know about the small teams that ran missions no one was supposed to talk about, in countries no one was supposed to be in, doing work that no one was supposed to acknowledge. And they don't know about the fight to keep those missions from being compromised by well-meaning institutional pressure to expand beyond sustainable limits. The phrase, "Stop sending us these guys," represents something larger than operational friction between special forces and conventional troops. It represents a brutal truth about how wars are fought when politics, secrecy, and survival intersect. Not every mission can be run with overwhelming force. Not every problem can be solved by adding more troops. Sometimes the mission demands the opposite: fewer people, better trained, operating with precision instead of power. The secret war in Laos and Cambodia proved that. Small teams, properly selected and trained, achieved strategic effects far beyond their numbers. They disrupted enemy logistics, gathered critical intelligence, and forced North Vietnamese forces to divert resources away from the main theater. But they also paid a price. The casualty rates for SOG recon teams were among the highest of any unit in the Vietnam War. Teams were overrun. Helicopters were shot down. Men were captured, killed, or simply disappeared into the jungle. And when institutional pressures threatened to dilute the standards that kept those teams alive, the operators pushed back, not out of arrogance, not out of elitism, but out of the hard-earned knowledge that in their kind of war, compatibility mattered more than numbers, and preparation mattered more than good intentions. The tension between special forces and conventional troops during this period wasn't about ego. It was about the reality that certain missions require certain people, and forcing the wrong fit gets everyone killed. In hidden wars, noise is the enemy. Visibility is the enemy. And sometimes, more troops is just more noise. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about the Vietnam War, you're not alone. Most of this history has stayed buried for decades. That's what American Hidden Wars is here for, to bring these stories out of the classified archives and into the light. If you found this valuable, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. There are more hidden wars to cover, and every one of them has lessons we're still learning from. The wars we don't talk about often matter more than the ones we do.